everyone, and welcome back to Sunday Reads with Renee. My name is Renee, and today I'm doing a book review of all the books I read for Winter Reads 2026 Challenge. For a recap, here are the books that I selected at the beginning of the year. As you can see, I had a collection of about 30 books to read this past winter. Some were nonfiction and a bunch of varieties, whether they're romance, newer books, a little bit of older works. And unfortunately, I only got through 29 of 30 of them. And that's because Now Back to You by B.K. Borison didn't come into the library for me on time, and therefore I wasn't able to read it. So I'm going to move it over into my spring reads of 2026 instead. Other than that, I got through 29 of them, which I'm very happy about. And I really enjoyed a lot of these works. It gave me a lot of things to find that were entertaining, even in a dark way. I also enjoyed the nonfiction works and thought they were pretty good. And I also enjoyed just reading a bunch of different works. I especially loved Tayari Jones' Kin, which is a new book, and I really enjoyed that, but more on that later. And I'm going to go over just a basic book review of all the books that I read, the 29 ones, I should say. And before I do, I just want to let everyone know that I'm going to be using alternative words and phrases because of YouTube rules and regulations. There are some triggering moments in these books, which I'll mention as I do the reviews, and also I'll be revealing plot details, therefore spoilers are ahead. We'll Prescribe You Another Cat by Syou Ishida. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But this is part of a book series that she does in Japan that have since been translated over into American English. And I truly appreciate it because I did enjoy this book. And it's more of a short story look at how different types of characters who are going through something end up coming to this magical clinic that prescribes them a cat as a form of a way to deal with the situations they're going through. In some cases, it's loss of a loved one and struggling to connect. Other times, it's someone who's going through a personal struggle and finds some solace in having a cat by their side. And it does offer both charm, heartwarming humor, as well as a little bit of tragedy and sadness to it. But I overall enjoyed it because you have different types of stories of different characters going through something that really need a cat in order to really help them go through whatever it is they're experiencing. And it is a very charming, whimsical type novel. It's reminiscent of some of the stories I see coming out of Japan translated into American English, whether it's dark, humorous, or just charming, feel good type stories, such as Before the Coffee Gets Cold series. And I really just enjoyed it. It's easy to get through because it's such a short book with such short stories from different people's perspectives. So it's something that I recommend if you love cats, and even if you don't like cats, this is just something that you can enjoy and take away with and have a little bit more prospect and some introspection. The Elsewhere Express by Samantha Sotto Yambao, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. If I don't, I apologize. But this is a more newer work published in 2026, and it's all about dealing with grief, hope, belonging, and struggles as well. And what takes place is that you have two characters named Rhea and Hugh. Rhea is someone who is going through grief over losing a loved one and struggling with that. Hugh is someone who is an artist that is struggling to find belonging in the world. And these are two people that meet on the Elsewhere Express, where they get a ticket to this train that is very magical and whimsy. And it takes them on this journey of magic and whimsy, and it feels very colorful and light and helps them really grapple with a lot of things they're going through. At the same time, there's a mysterious stranger who's stowed away on the train that is threatening to bring some darkness to this train and ultimately destroy this whimsy. So Rhea and Q really have to go through that and really defeat this mysterious stowaway or find some other way to really get through it. So what I really liked about the Elsewhere Express, though, is that it is a fun, entertaining read that does offer those themes of hope, belonging, and getting over your grief and trying to really overcome the challenges in your life. And I like the exploration of the grief as well as identity and belonging. And what I really took from this book is very much magical whimsy. I like the touch of the dark side there too, because I think that is needed in a lot of different types of works and how good versus evil or good triumphs over evil. So this is a very good book. I think The Elsewhere Express is something that you can get a lot of entertaining, fun, pleasure reads from it. And sometimes we need pleasure reads to get through the day, and I really enjoy pleasure reads. So The Elsewhere Express is a good one for it. It's very well written, and I highly recommend. Side note, it also reminded me a bit of Matt Haig's The Midnight Library, a little bit in that regard. So if you are a fan of Matt Haig's The Midnight Library, then The Elsewhere Express is for you. People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. And this is one that I really enjoyed because I have read some Emily Henry books before. But what it's basically about are two people named Alex and Poppy who meet in college and really connect and get along very well despite their different personalities. They become best friends, they really enjoy each other's company, and they connect. But things take a bit of turn after college graduation, where they go their separate ways. He returns to a small town. She goes off to New York City. But because they still enjoy each other's company and consider themselves best friends, they decide to meet once a year on vacation to any different types of destinations wherever they go. So they have a lot of different adventures over the course of the years, every summer on vacations. But when one incident takes place, it ends up changing everything, where they don't speak for about 2 years and now have to try and figure out, can we get back to where we were, or can we try to work through it? So this is a very entertaining, fun pleasure read for the most part. I really enjoyed the characters of Poppy and Alex. I thought they were interesting in their own way. And it's very much a typical Emily Henry read. I've already read a couple of her works before, such as Beach Read and Funny Story. So it is very much still the same as her other stories. People We Meet on Vacation is one that has a little bit of humor to it. It's got a little bit of romance, or budding romance, as we would say. And it also does focus a little bit more on these characters who are trying to grow in their own ways separately and together. And it's just an enjoyable one. So it's one that I do recommend, whether or not you're an Emily Henry fan, because it is a little bit of romance. It has a bit of whimsy, has a touch of humor as well as some growth to it. So I do recommend People We Meet on Vacation if you haven't read it yet. A Winter in New York by Josie Silver. And this is a 2023 published work that's all about second chance romances, intertwining years and connections, as well as dealing with the past and trying to overcome it. Iris is an aspiring chef who moves from London, England to New York City to start over. She's just left a very toxic relationship. She's still dealing with the grief of losing her mother 3 years prior, and going to New York City seems to be the next best thing for her. It's not just a chance to start over, but also to reconnect with her mother, because her mom used to be a singer in New York City, and she recalls all the photos from her mother's albums of the places that she went and traveled. And so Iris is doing that also as a way to keep connected with her mother as she still grapples with grief. One day, Iris is walking through Little Italy in New York City when she comes across a family owned gelato shop that's been there for decades, and recognizes the outside of the shop as a picture that's similar to the one in her mother's photo album. And so she goes into the shop and she tastes the gelato and is shocked to find that the gelato she's tasting is the same recipe that her and her mother made for years with their gelato maker that she has back at her New York City apartment. And Iris is understandably shocked. And as she goes through more of the history and details, she discovers that her mother has a connection with that family back when she was in New York City years ago. And Iris makes a connection with one of the family members named Gio, and they hit it off, and they start to have more of a romance together. But because Iris is keeping the secret held, she doesn't really know what to do when she starts to fall for Gio, and it could be a serious relationship. And there's a lot more that goes into this novel, of course, where Iris ends up meeting more of the older family members who remember her mother, and they end up having more of those connections and conversations. But it's overall a very good book. It's a nice romance. I did like the characters of Gio and Iris, and I think it is something nice to read about. And I think it is a very good book in its own way. It does touch on some dark elements too, such as toxicity in a relationship, which I can't give into too much detail because of YouTube rules and regulations. But I do recommend this book overall. I do think Josie Silver's other books are a little bit better, like One Day in December, but I overall think A Winter in New York is a nice, fun, entertaining romance with some growth, some introspective, as well as grappling with grief and trying to overcome toxicity in a relationship. The Perfect Find by Tia Williams. This 2016 published work is the first adult romance novel by Tia Williams, and it's about a woman named Jenna who is finding herself at the age of 40, starting from the bottom again. She did have a lot of success as a magazine writer for a long time, especially in the editorial department, but after a mental health breakdown, as well as the fallout from a long time relationship, she had to take some time away for a while. And when she decided to start back up again, going into her career career once more. She could only find a job doing blog posts and social media for a different magazine that's under the editorial watch of her arch nemesis, Darcy. And they have a long history that dates back about 20 years. So Jenna, deciding to really just take the bull by the horns, joins this magazine as a way to pay the bills, make some money. And it's a struggle for her to suddenly go from the top to the bottom and now having to work her way up again. And she ends up trying to move forward in a personal way as well. And she goes out to have a fun night. She meets a young man and they end up really connecting, having a kiss. It gets a little bit spicy here and there. And she ultimately ends up deciding to just take this as a one-time thing and just go on with her existence, only to find that the young man that she had this kiss and encounter with is actually the son of her arch nemesis, Darcy. To make matters worse, Darcy's son, who's named Eric, is going to be on the technical filming side to help Jenna really gravitate to a more wider audience through social media, and that makes things even more complicated between them. It does start a bit of a budding romance, but it does have a little bit of its ups and downs. There is a little bit more to Eric than meets the eye, even though he's young. He is someone that is ambitious, hardworking. He really wants to make things go. He doesn't really like working for his mom, but because he's not finding other options, he takes it as more of a temporary thing so he can find better opportunities going forward. And I did overall like the character of Jenna. It was interesting to relate to her on my end because at 38 years old, I've had to, at certain points, start over here and there at times. So I could relate to Jenna having to start over herself at the age of 40. But what did bother me a little bit more about this book was the epilogue, even though it was interesting in its own way. It kind of turned me off a little bit. It does end in a good way, I feel, but it did kind of turn me off a little bit more. And the other thing that kind of turned me off is the age gap. To be clear, Eric is 22 years old, to Jenna's 40, but for me at 38 years old, it's not something I would do. If a 22-year-old was interested in me, I'd be like, thank you, but I'm not really interested there because I think there's too much of an age gap. But outside of all that, I did think it was a nice, entertaining romance in its own way. It does have growth and introspective. I did overall like it, and while it does have some choppiness, and Tia Williams has better works like 7 Days in June, I do recommend The Perfect Find if you are a Tia Williams fan and you want to read a little bit more of her works. Well, Ashley by Mazey Eddings. And this is a book that's about second chance romance published in 2025 and how two people grapple with their past and their present and explores themes of misogyny, toxic masculinity, as well as identity. At 27 years old, Ava is someone who's not very happy in her career. She had hoped for a great journalism career, but the only thing she's doing right now is a blog video section called Babble, where she talks about different types of topics, and she's doing her more regular work for a media outlet called Soundbites. And the talk show she does is Sausage Talk, where she has interviews and conversations with B to D list celebrities while eating lukewarm hot dogs. So this is not something she ever wanted to do or expected for her journalism career, and her personal life isn't going well. While her friends have fulfilling professional and personal lives, she herself doesn't really have much of that, even in relationships. So she's understandably very sad and depressed about where her life is going. And one night she's watching a video from a man named Riley Cooper, who has this very popular social media platform telling women about the red flags in men so that way they can avoid toxic masculinity. And Ava is sickened by it because she remembers Riley from years ago when they were at college and they had an interesting night and they connected and they had a one night stand, and she was hoping this would turn into a relationship, or at least thinking it would. And then he ends up ghosting her completely, and it actually caused a lot of repercussions since then, where she really hasn't connected in relationships as a result of that trauma from her first time with Riley. And so she ends up in a drunken state making a video calling out Riley's hypocrisy and posting it online, and it ends up actually exploding on social media with almost 1 million views. And Ava's like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me now? My boss is going to be so upset. But the boss turns out to like it. It actually caused a lot of traction, and they now want to do a podcast segment between her and Riley Cooper. So they're back together again in their own way, in a way that is very uncomfortable for both of them, more particularly Ava. Nonetheless, it presents an opportunity for Ava to get a promotion and dismantle this reputation that Riley has formed over the years because she still believes it's hypocrisy and still relates to him as who he was years ago. And so, as they're doing this interview segment for her show, Sausage Talk, they end up actually reconnecting, going on a couple of dates, and they find out a lot about each other and a lot of the things that were going on at that time during the college years, where even Riley was dealing with his own problems and exploring some things, where he turned to things that he now knows weren't good for him in order to not really grapple with the fact that he is bi. And so there's a lot of different things that go on in this novel. There's a lot of explorations of grief as well as trauma, misogyny, toxic masculinity. It gets a lot into the online world and how that affects us in a lot of ways. And it is interesting to read all that stuff. And I did like the book in terms of the fact that it was exploration of these themes or the attempts to do it. And I did enjoy because it gave me a lot more thought provoking ways to think about all those types of themes. But I didn't really like the book in a lot of different regards because I just wasn't really gravitating to the pair of Riley and Ava. I just didn't really feel attached to them or wanting to root for them completely. And I did like one thing, which is that they have Riley wear glasses and he's considered attractive and handsome because growing up in the 90s, that really wasn't the thing. We actually considered glasses unattractive in movies and shows, which is why you have those dramatic makeovers where they remove the glasses and suddenly they're attractive. So it's actually kind of nice to have a woman be attracted to a man with glasses. And it's always nice to actually have a person who's attracted to another person who has glasses and finds them attractive and appealing. So that's something I did like. There is a lot of spice to this book, so be forewarned about that. Other than that, it's something that's more of a pleasure read, but not one that I would personally recommend. And then there was the one by Martha Waters. And this was published in 2025 and is a historical romance mystery novel taking place in 1930s England. Georgiana lives in a quaint village in the Cotswold and has become a little bit of a celebrity in her own right. She's now an accidental amateur detective who ended up solving 4 crimes in a single year. And it's not something she ever expected, but it just happened. And when someone ends up passing away and it's ruled as a heart attack, Georgiana doesn't think that's real because she believes that someone committed a crime against this man and ended up unaliving them. And so she decides to investigate and seeks out the assistance of a detective agency in London. But the only person willing to help her is a man named Sebastian, who is a secretary to the head of the agency. And Sebastian is a handsome man. He's charming. They connect immediately. They have a little back and forth, of course. And Georgiana really likes him, but because he has a reputation as a posh womanizer, she's not interested in anything serious with him because she doesn't believe it could be. But while they're having this kind of budding romance and connection, they end up really trying to work together to solve the crime, and they make an excellent team to figure out what exactly happened to this person. And this is one I really enjoy because it's such a great, well written, cozy mystery atmosphere. And I really like that aspect of it, but I also enjoyed the characters. I liked Sebastian and Georgiana. I felt they connected, got along pretty well. And I really liked how they worked together as a team, where they go through their own growth together and apart. So I really enjoyed all of that, but I especially liked the cozy mystery atmosphere with a dash of romance. It had very much Agatha Christie kind of vibes, but it had more of the romance element, which I liked and made it more enhanced and interesting. So this is something that I really recommend. It's one of my favorites from the Winter Reads section, so it's something I recommend because it's just that great. I really enjoy it. It was well done mystery. I think it's fantastic, and it's one that I highly recommend. The Seven Husbands of Eveyln Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this is a book that is very well known among Reid's works and is all about a woman named Eveyln Hugo. She's a reclusive Hollywood icon that doesn't really come into the spotlight very much anymore. She prefers to be by herself, not really interacting with many people. And then one day she contacts a woman named Monique Grant, and she is a journalist who isn't really on top of the world or a very well known one. She's having a lot of personal problems and professional ones as well. But for some reason, Eveyln wants to have Monique write her life story. And so Monique's a little surprised by it, but feels this is a way to jumpstart her career again. And so she agrees to interview Eveyln Hugo. And Eveyln, who's now in her 70s, is someone who really wants to tell her life story because everyone has always wondered what really went on in her life. And so Eveyln goes into more of a retrospective reflection of her entire life, from her beginnings of when she started out as a Hollywood starlet and was discovered up until her present time, along with the 7 husbands that were in her life at various different points. And what I liked about this book is that it has an interesting plot, but it's not really something that I gravitated to too much in many ways. And that's just because when I tried to read it in 2021, I didn't really like it too much, but I did enjoy it the second time around, which I do appreciate because it was part of book club. And I think if it wasn't for that book club, I probably wouldn't have reread it again. So I'm kind of glad about that in a way, because I did have a different feeling and opinion on The 7 Husbands of Eveyln and Hugo the second time around. I did like the plot aspect and how Eveyln is revealed to be connected to Monique Grant. And I also liked learning a lot about Evelyn's life, and it had some twists and turns to it. It showed a lot of different sides to Eveyln, the choices and decisions she made, some not of her own will, other times are things that just happened because they were there. And so it's a very interesting book in its own regard. It's just not something that I gravitate to. But if you are someone that is curious about this book and likes Reid's work, I would recommend it because it is her most popular work. Star Society by Gabriella Saab. And this is a historical fiction novel that takes place in the 1940s, where Ada is a rising star in Hollywood. Everything is going very well for her. She's very excited for these new aspects of her life, but she is hiding a dark secret where she used to be a member of the Dutch resistance. And the only reason she's in Hollywood or America at all is because she had escaped her war-torn country in order to come over to America to escape imprisonment as well for being a member of the Dutch resistance. So Ada has started her life over, and things seem to be going very well for her in Hollywood. But then things start to change when a woman named Ingrid shows up, and Ingrid is Ada's sister, her long distance believes deceased sister, and that causes a whole nother problem. But the reason Ingrid's here is because she's investigating communist influences in Hollywood. So it causes a lot of problems and strain. But then there are a lot of twists and turns that go through it as well. And while I did find the Star Society to be an interesting read in its own regard, the pacing was a little off for me. And I think because we had so many twists and turns in this book, it just didn't really appeal to me. Some things I did like were the fact that it dealt with Hollywood, the Dutch resistance, and communism, because I am a little familiar with how communism affected Hollywood and the negative effects it took on people who were not communist sympathizers, but were affected by it in a very negative way. And overall, I do think the Star Society is interesting in its own regards. I even like the sisters, but it wasn't an engrossing read to me. I feel like the pacing was off again, but it's something that I recommend if you like historical fiction and those types of plots and aspects. The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. This is a 2025 published historical crime fiction novel that takes place in August 1975, but goes back and forth into the 1950s and 1960s. The story starts out in August 1975 when Barbara Van Laar is discovered missing from her bunk at the camp she's staying at. Now, Barbara is a 13-year-old member of a very prominent, wealthy family, and the family is understandably concerned about what's happened to their child. But it also brings up old memories of something that happened 14 years ago where Barbara's older brother went missing and his body was never found. So it understandably brings up a lot of trauma, and now the family is understandably even more so worried that Barbara will not be found either. As the investigation takes place, they try to see if there might be a connection between Barbara and her older brother's disappearance as well. And so they try to connect that, and it goes through all this investigation very thoroughly with a lot of back and forth between 1975, 1950s, and 1960s, including the scene of the crime in which Barbara's older brother went missing. Now, what I did like about The God of the Woods is that it is a very well written work and a very thick book, so it took me a while to get through. And while I do think more could have been said with less, it could have been shortened a little bit, I did overall like it. I thought the mystery was interesting. I thought it was good for more to go back and forth between 1950 and 1960 and 1970 to give more context to this prominent wealthy family and their dysfunction and how that affected Barbara and her older brother. And what's interesting about this book is that it really delves into the time period as well. One of the things that I do think is interesting about it is when my book club members didn't really like the character of Alice, who is Barbara's mother. They found her to be very weak, and they really can't stand a weak character. And in a way, I can understand. I don't mind weak characters too much, but I do want to see if they grow to become stronger ones. So it's not something I really didn't mind, but I understood in terms of the historical context as to my book club members. So that was an interesting conversation we had. But in going back to The God of the Woods, I did think it was a well written work. But if I were to compare it between this one and Long Bright River, which is the only other Liz Moore book I read, I would choose Long Bright River. Other than that, I think God of the Woods is a good book. It's very well written. I just think it went on a little bit too long and could have been shortened. Sometimes less is more. Darkrooms by Rebbecca Hannigan. This 2026 thriller takes place over a span of 20 years in order for two people to solve the crime of a missing person that they loved. In 1999, 9-year-old Roisin lives in her small Irish village and decides to be brave and march into Hanging Woods, this mysterious area that has struck fear into adults and especially children for many years. Roisin marches into Hanging Woods and is never seen again. 20 years later, people are still grappling with this disappearance, especially Roisin's older sister Dee Dee, who's now a rookie cop, and Roisin's best friend Caitlin, who's now a petty criminal and was the last person to see Roisin alive before the disappearance. Now, Caitlin has come back 20 years later to really settle the affairs with her mother's recent passing, but the incidents of that time 20 years ago still haunt Caitlin and understandably Dee Dee too, and so the two decide to team up to investigate what actually happened and try to really get some kind of closure about what occurred to the person they loved the most in the world. Now, Dark Rooms is one that I did find to be an interesting thriller in its own way and a good one in some parts, but I couldn't help but notice similarities between this book and Tana French's In the Woods because of all the similarities, of course, where it involves woods, a mystery that spans 20 years that they have difficulty solving, even though it's not really a crux of the plot, but is integrated into the plot in itself. So that's what really reminded me when I was reading this book in the summary. But I did overall think it was a good thriller. I liked how it really delved into the explorations of grief and PTSD, especially between these two characters, Dee Dee and Caitlin, who have struggled with that all their lives for the past 20 years because of what happened to Rosen, where she just went missing and was never seen again. So I did think it was an interesting thriller in itself, but I didn't really like the pacing too much and I wasn't really fond of the plot. Other than that, I do recommend it if you just want to get your thriller kicks and you like mystery. So I do think it is very good and you get a sense of the Irish life too. Room 706 by Ellie Levenson. This is a 2026 published suspense thriller that talks about a woman named Kate, and she's someone who's a married mother who seems to have everything going for her, but she doesn't feel very fulfilled and is unhappy in her life in different ways. And in order for her to really feel fulfilled, she starts a affair. She's having a midday tryst in a hotel room with her lover when all of a sudden it's taken under siege by violent monsters. As a result, she ends up having to do a lot of reflection and back and forth about her life, and it explores the themes of womanhood, motherhood, as well as marriage. So overall, I thought this was an interesting, engrossing suspense thrill. It's more of a pleasure, entertaining read for suspense thrillers than anything else, but I couldn't really gravitate to it other than that. I do recommend it if you want to get your suspense thrill kicks, though. Nightshade by Michael Connelly. This 2025 novel takes place in Los Angeles, where Detective Stillwell is quote unquote exiled to Catalina Island after office politics drove him away from the job that he loved so much. And he is investigating a crime where a body has been weighed down in the harbor and is a Jane Doe. But as he investigates this crime, he finds out there's more than what it appears to be and involves a lot of island politics as well as politics in Hollywood too, and they interclash with each other quite a bit. And this is a typical crime procedural type novel that I see in a lot of places, and it was a book club pick, so it's something that I read just because it was part of a book club pick. And I did like it in some ways. I thought it was an engrossing read. I did like the character of Stillwell. I thought he was an interesting one, more of a hard-boiled cop that you're used to in the old school 1950s one, so there is a bit of a noir there. And the mystery was interesting in its own way, but overall, it was something that I think is just more of a typical crime novel, and upon further reflection, I do feel it's slow at certain points where it could have been done more with less. But overall, I did think Nightshade was an interesting one. So if you do like those typical crime novels with hard-boiled cops, this is one for you. The Summer Guest by Tess Gerritsen. This 2025 crime novel is the second book in the Martini Club series about a group of retired CIA agents who assist the local police with different types of crime. In Purity, Maine, a teenager goes missing, and as they do an investigation to try and find her, they end up discovering that her disappearance may be connected with a crime that took place a little more than 40 years ago in 1972, to be exact. And so it goes through a thorough investigation with a couple twists and turns. And I did like this one in a lot of regards. I found it to be a typical crime novel, of course, but I did like it in some regards in terms of twists and turns, a few things that popped up here and there, and overall did enjoy it. But I do think at times it was a little bit slower upon further reflection when I go over my notes again. And I do think there could have been a little bit more with less, but other than that, I do think The Summer Guest was interesting. So if you are a Tess Gerritsen fan and you do like the Martini Club series but haven't really read the second book, this is one that I do recommend. The M Word at World's End by Ross Montgomery. Published in 2026, this is a historical crime fiction mystery novel that takes place in 1910 Cornwall. Stephen Pike has recently been released from prison for a crime he didn't commit and is looking to start over. With the upcoming Haley's Comment, there is a need for a new butler at Tith Hall, and so he takes that position and joins in the family for all the preparations. Everything seems to be going fine at first until the Viscount is found unalive the next day, having a crime committed against him. And so an investigation takes place, and they do point to Stephen Pike, who they think may have done it because of his criminal past, but he says he didn't do it. And Miss Decima Stockingham, a matriarch of the family who's 80 years old, doesn't believe that Stephen did it either. She's gotten to know this man a little bit and doesn't think he's someone that would commit a horrific crime like that. And so the two team up to do a thorough investigation into who it was that M-worded the Viscount. And I overall really liked this one. I thought it was a very good mystery novel that I found highly enjoyable and engrossing. I like the mystery in itself, but I particularly like the characters of Stephen and Decima and their teamwork and the connection they have. We get to know a little bit about Decima too, who had all these scientific goals and ambitions that were never completely fulfilled. There is a little bit more to it, which I won't reveal though. And I overall enjoyed it. So this is something that gives a lot of mystery vibes, similar to Agatha Christie. And I just really enjoyed it overall and highly recommend reading it. And it's an exciting new series from Ross Montgomery too. The First Time I Saw Him by Laura Dave. And this is a sequel to Dave's best-selling work a few years prior called The Last Thing He Told Me. And as a result, it's more of a sequel than anything else published in 2026. So this is bringing us back into Hannah's world where she has formed some kind of a life for herself with her stepdaughter Bailey because of the events of the previous book where her husband Owen dropped off the face of the earth, disappeared, they couldn't find him anywhere. And so this is more of a continuation than anything else. And what I did find interesting is coming back into Hannah's world where she has a better relationship with her stepdaughter Bailey than they did in the previous book. They formed a connection over the 5 years since Hannah's husband Owen disappeared. But the thing about this book this time around is that Owen has come back into Hannah's life. He's come out of hiding and he needs her assistance to help take down a crime syndicate organization so they can be together again. So I did like this one in some regards, but at the same time, I really don't think The Last Thing He Told Me needed a sequel. I thought it ended fine. I liked the open-ended enoughness of it, and I didn't really think it needed another sequel. But I do think if you enjoyed the first book, this is something that I would recommend if you're curious about a sequel and to find out what happens next. And it is a well-written one. It has a couple twists and turns in it, but I overall just didn't think it was needed entirely, and I actually felt like The Last Thing He Told Me was a better way to end that story and not come back to it. That's just my opinion, though. Anatomy of an Alibi by Ashley Elston, published in 2026. This is a suspense thriller mystery that is focusing on two women named Camille and Aubrey. Now, Aubrey is someone who has been grappling with her parents passing for many years by a drunk driver, whereas Camille is dealing with the controlling relationship from her husband, Ben, who's a lawyer that's very corrupt. These two women meet and end up forming a connection because of the situation with Ben, as Aubrey believes that Ben may have had something to do with her parents' death. And so the two women form a plan to create an alibi in order to find some information on Ben, only to have everything go sideways completely and now have to deal with the fallout and the twists and turns that come their way. I did think this was an excellent thriller. I found it very engrossing, very quick to get through, which I'm glad about because it was one of the final books I read at the end of the winter read section. And I overall liked it in general. At first, I thought it was going to be more like Strangers on a train a type situation, but it ended up being a little bit different in some regards. But I did overall like it. I thought it was very good. I liked the twists and turns. It had an ending that felt very fitting and suspenseful in its own way, and I just really liked it. So I do recommend Anatomy of an Alibi if you haven't really read that yet, and I just recommend it because I thought it was great. The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon, hope I pronounced that correctly, was published in 2014 and is a psychological thriller with some supernatural elements and a haunting ghost story. In 1908, a woman named Sarah is living in her small town of Vermont, only to be found deceased in a field behind her house just several months after the tragic passing of her young daughter Gertie. Now, in the present day, 19-year-old Ruthie is living in Sarah's home despite the fact that townspeople say it's haunted, and she's living in this house with her mother Alice and her younger sister Fawn. Everything seems to be fine despite the strange happenings occurring in the house, but then one day, Ruthie's mother ends up going missing. And then there's an exploration into the investigation where they end up seeing more strange happenings and ghostly experiences occurring as well as they try to uncover a mystery from more than 100 years ago. But what I liked about The Winter People is that it's an excellent read. It's edge of your seat, a huge page turner, which I really enjoy. It has a lot of these supernatural elements, the haunting ghost story, and I just overall loved it. And it's something that has been on my to be read list for a while, and I'm really glad I finally did read it. So if it's something that you haven't read yet, or maybe you have and want to give a reread, I would highly recommend because I really liked a lot of aspects of it. The only thing that I do think is unfortunate about it is that they had too many characters to it that I think they could have gotten rid of because I get why they're in the story, but I just don't think they needed to be. But overall, I do think the story is excellent. So again, it's one that I highly recommend. Vigil by George Saunders. This is a 2026 published novella that really focuses more on corporate greed, climate change, effects on the environment, and absolution. Jill is a spirit guide who, for over 200 times, has done her spiritual guide work. She's passed away in the 1970s, and therefore she acts as a guide to take the recently deceased on a retrospective of their entire life to have some reflection before she heads them on their way. And her latest one is K.J. Boone, an oil tycoon who had a lot of effects on the environment as a result of his oil and is an unremorseful person. Jill hopes that KJ will be able to really focus on this and have some type of epiphany even in the afterlife, but he seems to be completely unremorseful. And this is an interesting work in its own way. I thought because it was such a short book that I would be able to get through it quickly, but unfortunately the writing structure didn't really make it easy for me at least. And I thought it was an interesting work in itself, of course, but I really didn't gravitate to him too much. It wasn't very engrossing. But if you are a fan of George Saunders' work and like this idea of the plot, then I do recommend it because I do think it does have interesting themes. It just didn't really gravitate to me very much. Kin by Tayari Jones. This 2026 work is a well anticipated one because Tayari Jones did such a great job with An American Marriage, and it's been a long time since she's had a new work come out, and it's well worth your wait because it's such an excellent, wonderful read. The story takes place from 1940s to 1960s in the American South, where Bernice and Annie are childhood friends in Honeysuckle, Louisiana. Both are motherless in their own way, and they end up bonding at first because of that and becoming very good friends as a result. But as adults, they go their separate ways. Bernice goes off to college, where she becomes part of a more affluent Black community, whereas Annie takes different paths and goes through some ups and downs. And these are two friends who had a bond and connected, and they end up having those separate ways, but coming back together and going through their own types of growth together and apart. And it's just a really excellent work. It deals with a lot of the themes of race, American South, motherhood, daughters and all those types of relationships, including female friendships. It also grapples with a sense of belonging because these two young women are outcasts in their own way in their small town of Honeysuckle because everyone knows what's happened with their mothers. One was abandoned by their mother, the other, their mother passed away in a very violent way. And so they end up having that sense of belonging that they go on as into adulthood. But I overall thought this was a really great book. It had some heartwarming moments, even amidst its dark truths about the American South and racism. And it's just a great work overall. I do think that Tayari Jones had such a great work with An American Marriage. It's hard to really compare to that, but I overall really liked Kin. I thought it was an excellent read. It's well worth that wait, and I do highly recommend because if you loved An American Marriage, you're going to love Kin. Fireflies in Winter by Eleanor Shearer. Published in 2026, this historical fiction novel takes place in 1796 Nova Scotia, Canada, and it focuses on two young women named Agnes and Cora. Cora is a young Jamaican orphan who's been sent to Nova Scotia so she can start her life over, whereas Agnes is a young woman in hiding. The two end up meeting by chance and they decide to form a bond by trying to survive the wilderness and the harsh environment that's in Nova Scotia, especially in the winter time. And they end up forming a connection and bonding, even starting a little bit of a romance for themselves. But the reality hits harder when time goes by and they end up having to deal not just with the harsh environment and the reality of their life, but also the past coming to fruition and them having to really grapple with it. I overall really liked this one. I thought it was very good in a lot of ways, and it was very much a page turner, which I enjoyed, and it had a lot of interesting twists and turns. But I did enjoy the fact that Fireflies in Winter explores the themes of survival, resilience, fear, freedom, and identity, especially between the main characters, Cora and Agnes, as they start to build a romance with each other that was quite taboo between two women in 1796, especially. But there's also other elements to it, including the dark history of a country's past with enslavement as well as about race. And this happens in a lot of places across the world, of course, even here in America. But I did overall enjoy those themes. I liked learning a little bit more about them and how they were explored. But I did think Fireflies in Winter was an overall well written book, and I highly recommend it. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, published in 1952. This is a classic work that still stands the test of time even 70 years later. It's a book that's all about a nameless African American man who goes through a huge coming of age journey in so many different ways as he grapples with the racism, self identity, struggles for identity, finding belonging, as well as the racism that happens in the American South, as well as Harlem and at college when he has that opportunity to go. Invisible Man is just a great book. It's a very well written one, a fantastic debut for Ralph Ellison, and explores interesting themes with dark humor. It's a little hard to get through because of the triggering moments in a thick book, but I do think the triggering moments are important because they do reflect a lot about American society, especially in the 20th century, and everything this nameless African American man goes through, where he's struggling with racism, self identity, belonging, especially in the 20th century, and he can't really find that pretty much anywhere. So he goes through various different stages of his life in the 20th century. And I just really like this book. I thought Invisible Man was a great book. It's really entertaining, engrossing. It has a lot of darkness to it, of course, but it's one I recommend if you haven't read it yet. And if you have read it, I recommend a reread because there's a reason why it still remains a classic work 70 plus years later. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Published in 1937, this still remains a classic even more than 80 years later, and for good reason. It tells the story of Janie Crawford, who in her 40s has returned to her hometown and reflects a lot about her life and the ups and downs as she left years ago in order on a journey of self-discovery and empowerment to find better of herself. She reflects a lot through flashback on her failed relationships, her ups and downs, the struggles for self-discovery, identity, as well as with racism and everything in between. But what I really liked about this book the second time around that I read it is that it's an excellent work still. I really took out more of the themes more than ever before, where here's Janie, an African American woman, taking chances advances with her life, despite the fact that she's in the rural South and she wants more for herself, even though there's a lot of racism that still exists in America, especially in the 20th century. And she still takes a lot of charge. She's a headstrong person who really tries her best to go on this journey of self discovery. It's also one of the reasons that I like the character of Janie, and I think it's an overall well written book. I think it's marvelous and a fast read, so I really enjoy it, and I hope you will give it a chance if you haven't read it yet, or if you haven't read it in a while. Do give it a reread because I do think Their Eyes Are Watching God is still very excellent. This is Happiness by Niall Williams, and this was a published 2019 novel that focuses back and forth between the present day and 1950s in a rural Irish town. The story starts out with a man named Noah who now is elderly, and he looks back on his life in 1950s where he really came of age and had a transformative time. He was in the 1950s a 17-year-old kid who went to live with his grandparents after he left seminary school. He had promised his mother he would become a priest, and he decided it wasn't really for him, so he's dealing with a lot of guilt and kind of grappling with that. Now, at 17 years old, he's going through a coming of age, having to live in this rural town with his grandparents, and in comes a man named Christy who wants to bring electricity to that rural town, therefore eliminating the traditional way of life that this town is so used to. And they end up forming a bit of a connection. Noah's very interested in him in a charismatic way. He likes his thought process and finds the man to be very charismatic. At the same time, they both discuss the regrets they've had. In Christie's case, he left a woman at the altar many years ago who lives in the same town, and he wants to find a way to make amends with her. And it is a very excellent read. I overall liked it a lot, and I liked this look at the 1950s rural Ireland, which was very interesting. But I also liked how they explored electricity and it being implemented, but also how it does affect traditional lifestyles and makes a lot of changes in both a positive and negative way. But overall, I liked it because it is very much a coming of age story for Noah as he looks back on that transformative time in his life to see if he thinks differently about it, but also how it affected him in positive ways. And I think it's a very interesting book overall. So if you really like the rural Irish life in a lot of different types of stories and these connections that people make in a tiny rural village, I do highly recommend This Is Happiness. It's a well written book. I really enjoyed it because it had those charming, heartwarming moments mixed with the tragic, but also a lot of thought provoking moments too. Vigilance by Andrew K. Deemer. And this is a book that I really enjoy because it focused more on William Still, who was the father of the Underground Railroad based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it goes in through a basic biography on William Still life from the beginnings of his birth in the 1820s up until all the work he does throughout his entire lifetime in support of Black freedom. He's someone that really fights for it, helping with the Underground Railroad alongside Harriet Tubman and others. And he also fights to end enslavement. He also fights for equality and civil rights. This was a very good biography overall. I liked the in-depth knowledge, the meticulous research. I thought it was a very well done biography that gave me more insight into someone who was part of the Underground Railroad, but wasn't really someone that had a lot of a fame that was associated compared to Harriet Tubman. So this was an exciting read for me and one that I really enjoyed, and I do recommend it for everyone here because I did think it was a well done, meticulously researched book, and it gives a great insight into the Underground Railroad from the perspective of William Still, who was very much involved in it, and you'll find some interesting little things that pop up too. So overall, Vigilance is a good book. I really enjoyed it, and I do recommend it. The Great Contradiction by Joseph J. Ellis. And this was an excellent work, very well written and a nice read because it focuses on the tragic side of America's founding, where despite the great aspirations and intentions of creating a foundation for liberty and freedom, there was a hypocrisy there because despite fighting for this, they were still enslaving people and removing Indians off their land. And it made sense to me because this was something I was looking forward to reading because even though I am a proponent for what America's founding was about, which was liberty and freedom, there is that hypocrisy and dark side to it, along with a tragic one, because even though we had the great intentions of fighting for liberty and freedom, it doesn't make sense because to say that is wrong when you're enslaving people and removing Indians off their land, which is a huge tragic side of America's founding and American history in general. And what I liked is that it was a good book that really opened up more for discussion, which is something I enjoy, but at the same time don't like. And the reason I say this is because I really was looking forward to a more in-depth discussion knowledge about it, but because it's such a short work, a little under 200 pages, it doesn't really delve into it too much, which was a disappointment to me because I was hoping for a more in-depth look. There's also the fact that there isn't a lot of talk about Indian removal on it, but in fairness, Ellis does put at the introduction that his purpose is to promote discussion and observation. And it's also what makes a point of saying that he had just more information about enslavement side than he did about Indian removal. So those are part of the reasons why we have what we have with the Great Contradiction. But I really do appreciate that Ellis wanted to create more discussion because when I previously earlier in the year talked about why it is that I like nonfiction books, there is a con to the fact that some people don't like them because they feel there's too much of an author bias at times. So I actually do appreciate that Ellis tried not to do that with this book and really wanted the purpose of just presenting the information, doing a little bit of take, but wanting to create more discussion and observation. So I do recommend reading The Great Contradiction because it does get the discussion flowing, especially as we enter our 250 year of our founding. I, on a personal level, am appreciative of being in America, but I also understand that we have a dark history that we still need to reckon with and discuss. And I do appreciate that we have lots of conversations about this over the years, especially more so than ever. More books and writings are being done about it. And I think these are very important to do and discuss. So it's very good that we do discuss those flaws and the tragic side of America's founding with the great things that were about it. It's good to have that mixture and discussion. That's what the Great Contradiction does succeed in doing. America's Women by Gail Collins. And this is a book published in the early 2000s that is a nonfiction work focusing on the 400 years of American history, more particularly what women gave and contributed to and their experiences throughout those 400 years of history. And this is an interesting one for me because I've read it the third time around this year, and I'm very excited for that because I took into account more things that I didn't really notice before, which is more particular interest in the 1600s women, the 1700s women, and the 1800s women, particularly with the pioneers. And the reason for that is because I'm just thinking a little bit more about the 250th anniversary of America's founding and the contributions women made to that, but also about the pioneer women too, because like the women in the 1600s, they're going off into new spaces and worlds, whether it's from a different country like England or France and coming to the new world of America, or if you're based in America and you're going out west. So these women are taking chances on going into different places that they haven't been before, but there is a side to it that we need to take into account, which is that sometimes it's against their will because their husbands have decided to go and they've gone along with them, or they've done it out of necessity for different reasons. And so that's something to take into account that I came to be more interested in the third time around and a little bit more wary of too, because I'm thinking more about where we are in 2026, where thankfully women in America do have a little bit more freedom to do some things, even though there are some talk about how that's not happening. But I do think it's a little bit more of an improvement than in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. What I did take into account when I read this book again, though, is that it doesn't really do a lot of focus on non-white women. And by that, I mean that it doesn't have a lot of meticulous research into, say, Black women who are only focused on through the enslavement lens and the civil rights lens, but not too much on an individual space. Even though there are mentions of it in the book, there isn't a lot of it going on. And that doesn't surprise me because, again, this book was published in the early 2000s, so the research was what it was, or Collins didn't do enough meticulous research into it at the time. And perhaps if she published this book today, she would have done a little bit more, which is why I think it's good to have America's Women as something to do a more broad overview of the 400 years of women's contributions to America, because we can take that into account a little bit more, get some ideas. We can also put the book aside and go off and do more individual research and learn a lot more things because there has been more meticulous research done in the 20 plus years since the book was published. And there have been a couple updates to Collins' works, which I haven't read, so therefore I can't really go into too much detail about that, though I do advise you to do your own research as well. And I do recommend America's Women overall because I do still like it the third time around. I still enjoy it. It does make me want to go out and read more books and think a little bit more critically about women's role in America and the different types of women's roles in America as well. The Missing Thread by Daisy Dunn. And this is one I was really excited for because it's a nonfiction work that focuses more on women's contribution to the ancient world. And I was very curious to see what Daisy Dunn had written, but it is very understandable why there couldn't have been a more broader look at everything because women did have a limited role in the ancient world unless they left something behind other than just their daily life or their status. And in the case of Daisy Dunn's book, that is very much present in her introduction, and I do appreciate that she put it out there. But what I did find in this book is that it does focus on different parts of the ancient world, especially Rome, Greece, and Persia. We do have some famous figures pop up here, like Cleopatra, but we also have lesser known ones like Sappho and Enduana in there. So there is a little bit more of a broader context in it. And of course, they also do look at archaeological finds and they put that in there. And some of it is understandably uncomfortable because a lot of it does deal with underage girls having to make different choices, sometimes against their will. And I'm not surprised by that because in the ancient world, life expectancy was very short and sometimes even shorter than that for one reason or another. So there is that uncomfortable side to it. And I do appreciate that Dunn puts that in the book and lays it out for all the readers to read and discuss and think about. The book itself, though, did leave me wanting more because of how limited the scope is. I do appreciate that Dunn tried to put as much as she could in this book, and it did give me a lot to think about and want to explore a little bit more. But unlike America's Women by Gail Collins, The Missing Thread is something that didn't really have an opportunity to do a more broad overview because there is such a limited scope and knowledge and information about the women of the ancient world. But overall, I did like the book in general. I do think it's something to read if you want to know more about ancient women. And also, you can take that and go out there and explore a little bit more. There are some different types of books being written, especially the last 10 years, about women's role in the ancient world. And I do recommend you taking Missing Thread as something to start off with and then looking at other types of books in order to explore more. On Morrison by Nam Wale Serpil. And this is a more newer work published in early 2026, and I was looking forward to reading it. At first, I thought it was going to be more of a biography on Toni Morrison, but it turns out that that wasn't the case. And for those of you who are unaware of Toni Morrison, she is a very talented Black author who really helped to shape the 20th century in terms of Black female writing. And I really enjoy a lot of her works, including Beloved as well as Jazz. So I do recommend reading her works if you haven't yet, or if you have read her works in the past, be sure to give it a reread. So I honestly thought this was going to be a biography on Toni Morrison, but it turns out that it's more of a critique and analysis of her works and going into more of a deeper dive on it. And I really do appreciate that because even though I disagree with the fact that she's someone whose work is overshadowed by her public persona, because I think that she actually had a lot of great works, and I don't think it really, from my perspective anyway, overshadowed by her public persona. I still really enjoyed this book overall because it really gives a deep dive into a lot of Morrison's works and different types of ones, whether it was Blue Eye, Beloved, or Jazz, some of her plays and her poetry as well. So this really is a good critique analysis of Toni Morrison's work, where her inspirations comes from, how we've interpreted it, and a lot of the reasons why this book was written is because the author ended up having a lot more discussions, deep dives, analysis, and interpretations of the work, as well as doing more meticulous research. But what I took from On Morrison, though, is a little bit more of an appreciation for Toni Morrison than before, in that she really did have a lot of meticulous thought process into what she wanted with her work, or what she tried to really convey in her works, what she took from her interviews and her thought processes, how she worked through it, how she made her stories come to life, and the great storytelling that she did. I especially have appreciation that Toni Morrison narrated her own audiobooks because she wanted to keep the integrity of her work intact. And if you ever listen to the audio versions of her books with her as a narrator, it's very good. She had such a wonderful voice. But again, On Morrison is a great critical analysis of Toni Morrison's work that I do recommend because it gives you a little more insight again into her writing process or thought process, where she got her ideas from. So this is a really enjoyable one, and I highly recommend whether or not you're a fan of Toni Morrison. And this concludes the Winter 2026 Reads with the Book Reviews. Tell you that was a lot to get through, but I'm very happy I did. And now tell me what you think. Have you read any of these books? Do you agree with me? Disagree with me? What are your basic opinions on them? What books have you read that aren't part of this list that you would recommend? Please let me know in the comments below. I welcome all discussions as always. And now I'm going to show you my spring reads for 2026. Here they are. So as you can see just by that look, and you can pause it if you'd like and go back, I have a mixture of different ones. Some are newer works, some are a little older books. I have at least one classic, The Count of Monte Cristo, which I'm looking forward to reading it. And I have a lot of different types of books in here, of course, for Spring Reads 2026. I'm also going to be returning next week with a few different topics here now that the month of March is over, and get back to more of those varieties I had. I kind of got sidetracked a bit because of Women's History Months and Romance Month and Black History Month. So I'm looking forward to going back to that a little bit more. But this concludes my entire Someday Reads with Renee section, and I thank you so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell. I'll be back next Sunday with another Sunday Reads video, and you can also look out for my other videos, which will be a random one on Wednesday and a Food Friday video as well. I'll also be finally getting back into doing more shorts. I got a little sidetracked with that, but I'm planning to do a little bit more here and there. And I thank you so much for tuning in again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.